In the state of California, your employer can require you to take the COVID-19 vaccine or be terminated, unless you fall under one of two exceptions. The first one is under the ADA, and that is whether you have a pre-existing condition that would preclude you from taking the COVID-19 vaccine safely. Now, the second exception is under Title VII, under the religious exemption. Now, under that exemption, you're going to need to show that you have a deeply held religious belief and that belief is sincere, and that belief also precludes you from taking the COVID-19 vaccine. Now, in both of those situations, you're going to have to provide your employer with evidence. So when your employer is asking you whether or not you can or cannot take the COVID-19 vaccine and you say, hey, I have a deeply held religious belief, your employer is able to ask you for evidence. And this video is going to teach you exactly what the employer is going to be thinking and exactly what the employee should be thinking as well. Hi, my name is Adam Juratovac and I'm a California employment lawyer. And you could follow me anywhere on the internet at my handle, @AdamJ_the_lawyer. I'm based out of San Jose, California, and work primarily in employment litigation. However, I do represent employers as well. So the information that I'm going to be providing in this generic video will be discussing the information that I share with my clients, as well as the information I share with the general public. Now, this is a reminder that this video is for informational purposes only, and I'm not your lawyer. If you need legal advice, you should go seek an attorney. And unless you and I have a relationship and an agreement in writing, I am not your lawyer and I do not represent you. Now let's discuss how an individual can request an exemption to take the COVID-19 vaccine at work. So one example that would preclude an individual from receiving the COVID-19 vaccine is if they have a deeply held religious belief that their body is connected to the body of Christ, and then that body cannot be tainted by the COVID-19 vaccine. Now when I hear an individual tell me that, I start asking a lot of different questions. I start asking questions about their vaccination history. I start asking questions about their medical history. Because if that is your deeply held religious belief, that deeply held religious belief needs to apply across the board into all circumstances and all situations. Now, if the deeply held religious belief only applies to the COVID-19 vaccine and not any of these other vaccinations that they've taken throughout their life, then that can be an issue. And if an employer, if they request additional information regarding your deeply held religious belief, and then the questions that are going to come up is that you have been vaccinated recently, then they're going to determine that might not be a deeply held religious belief. Some other reasons that I've heard is that there's an mRNA compound in the COVID-19 vaccination. And I'm not a scientist, I'm a lawyer. So I cannot reasonably explain what that mRNA does to the body, and I cannot explain if that indeed will affect your blood and indeed will affect the temple of Christ, that is your body. So I'm not going to talk about that. But also, that's none of my business. My business is not to determine whether someone's belief is reasonable to me. My job is to determine whether they have a deeply held and sincere religious belief, period. Now, one situation that I talk about, and one example that I give to my clients, is that if they're in the situation where they believe that they're exempt from the COVID-19 vaccine for a religious purpose, I advise them to start talking to their employer first, and then at the same time, on a parallel track, I advise them to start speaking with their pastor, their priest, or their spiritual leader. Now, when they start speaking with their pastor, priest, or spiritual leader, then that'll allow them to open up a conversation and get to know that individual a little bit more. So when that spiritual leader understands a little bit more about the individual's concerns, especially as they apply to the religion, the religious leader might be a little bit more apt to write a letter on that individual's behalf to the employer about the religious belief. Now, y'all want to be very careful, because if you want to take this with a fine-tooth comb, there's a lot of questions that will be asked, and you could answer them as broadly as possible. You also can answer the questions as narrowly as possible, because you only need to be answering the question. Now, sometimes where I see individuals falter is that when their employer asks them what their deeply held religious belief is, the individual employee oftentimes gets frustrated, concerned, and pissed off. Now, when you have an employee that's pissed off, that feels like their religion is being questioned, that's when people can start acting unreasonable on both sides. Now, if you are requesting a religious exemption to the COVID-19 vaccine, you need to make sure you keep a level head. You need to make sure that you follow the rules, because screaming louder in these situations won't always help. So another exemption that would preclude an individual from taking the COVID-19 vaccine is under the ADA. Now, under the ADA, if you have a medical reason that would preclude you from taking the vaccine, that would be acceptable. And then you give your employer notice of that medical reason, and then your employer is going to start asking you questions. your employer needs to undertake and go through an interactive process to determine whether they can or cannot accommodate your exception. Now, what that looks like is your employer is going to see if they can have extra office space that they could stick you in, if they can require you to wear masks at work, or if they can socially distance you from the rest of the employees. Now, if you request an accommodation or the exception under the ADA, then you need to provide your employer notice that you have a health reason that would preclude you from taking the COVID-19 vaccine. Now, your employer is going to ask you, what's your health reason? And before everyone gets really frustrated that they have to share their personal information, I just want to let you know that your employer asking you for more information is reasonable and it's not illegal. When they ask you what your health reason is, you don't need to give them the 10-year history of your health. You need to give them a couple reasons that why you have underlying medical conditions that would preclude you from taking the COVID-19 vaccine. I know I've heard one example where an individual took the COVID-19 vaccine. He was sick as a dog for the next several days. He felt like his heart was palpitating. He went to the hospital multiple times to check on his health after taking that first COVID-19 vaccine. But when he went to his doctor and asked if he can receive an exemption from taking the second dose, the doctor sent that request to a panel of doctors at the hospital and he was declined. I told him that he should go seek other medical providers just to receive their medical expert opinions. Because if he had a history of being hospitalized after the first COVID-19 vaccine from what his body was doing, it might be reasonable that he shouldn't have to take the second COVID-19 vaccine. That's one very niche area of exemptions. Now, when I'm looking at more exemptions, I'm thinking about people with underlying medical conditions, especially when they have several underlying medical conditions that can come together and really form a bodily situation where you do not need to have the COVID-19 vaccine affect it or impact that or change it. If you're one of those people, then you need to tell your employer that you can't take the COVID-19 vaccine because you have a health condition. And then your employer is going to ask you, what's your health condition? And then you could say, I have several underlying health conditions that would preclude me from taking the COVID-19 vaccine. And if you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to in this level, you can add what your underlying health conditions are. Now, your employer, if they ask you another question and say, hey, I don't believe that these are underlying health conditions that are legitimate where you don't have to take the COVID-19 vaccine. Your employer is not a doctor either. So if they do ask that question, one thing you can say that is that's kind of unreasonable and you're willing to receive a doctor's note. You're willing to get a doctor's note, but you would think that your verbal communication and your spoken word would be good enough. But either way, you got to get them that doctor's note. Now, if they continue to ask you questions about your underlying medical conditions or your medical health, after you provide them with a doctor's note, that could be excessive. And that's when I would have a problem with an employer, because how much information do they need to know? They only need to know enough information where they can make an educated decision and engage in the interactive process with an employee to determine whether they can reasonably accommodate that person. And in this situation, if that reasonable accommodation allows them to wear a mask while inside of the work, that's okay. If that reasonable accommodation allows them to work from home, that's okay. But the employer must go through that interactive process. And if they just blanketly deny your accommodation under the ADA, it might not be illegal, but it doesn't look good. Now, under the ADA, your employer is required to engage in the interactive process, and if you ask them a question, then they automatically say no. Does that look like an interactive process? I do not think so. Now, to wrap things up, the state of California is allowing employers to require the COVID-19 vaccine at work. And if an employee does not want to take the COVID-19 vaccine, they can get fired unless they fall under one of the two exceptions. Now, I'm only speaking about the state of California because there are other states that are enacting new laws, such as the state of Texas. The Texas governor has created a law that there will be no mandatory vaccine mandates, and that's just a different approach. But regardless of where you are, know your rights. You need to understand your rights in the workplace or else you're going to be walked all over. Now, if you're interested in learning more, I did prepare a legal outline discussing whether it is constitutional to require a COVID-19 vaccine at work and the exceptions under the rule. In that legal outline, I also discussed the approach that your employer is going to be taking when you provide them notice of an exemption to the COVID-19 vaccine. I also explained a little bit more about the law that you're going to receive a background on, so that way you can understand a little bit more about what's going on behind the scenes. Now, if you're interested in purchasing that law pack, you can find it in the description here. It can also be found on my website at www.juratavaclaw.com. Now, I wish you the best of luck. If you have any questions, please contact an attorney. Remember, this is not legal advice and I'm not your attorney, but I do want to provide you with really good general information. So that's it on this lesson. Now, I'm a California attorney based out of San Jose, California, and I'm trying to put more legal information, more general legal information online, especially during these YouTube videos. So please like, comment, and subscribe to my channel, and feel free to share it with your friends. Thank you.